I'm going to show you now a little practice you want to do before you actually are ready to paint next week. So there's two parts of this week's lesson. One is creating the preliminary drawing and transferring it onto your watercolor paper. And the other is doing a little quick practice of wet into wet and graded wash. So I'll show you that. Before I do that, these are some examples that my students had done, my high school, and there might even be some middle school kids in this. But they had a little bit different assignment than you. They were using a nice paper, but it wasn't a real watercolor paper. And I did want them to do a crayon resist on the contours of the flower, and then everybody had to try one of the texture techniques that I had taught them in the background. And this particular one is salt, and you can see the wet into wet going on here, and this is a graded wash. So if we look at the photos in a minute, we'll see examples of flowers that would tend to call for one or the other of those. But anyway, this is a nice rose, and you can see they were real careful about drawing it all out. Another option, Georgia O'Keeffe did shells and she did bones. So if you want to go off and try that, it's a little trickier because those tend to be white with a lot not really bright colors. So you have to work with the values, but it might be a nice challenge. This background is saran wrap or plastic wrap, and I'll show you how to do that next week. And this is a nice wet into wet to get that dull color of the bird of paradise. The only thing you have to be careful of is that your background doesn't squish into the actual positive space. There's another one, great salt background. One of the things I suggested they do is use a complementary color outline. If they knew their flower was going to be red, then they could use green crayon for outlining, and the leaf being green then would have a red outline. So that's something to consider. Here's some great examples of graded wash. If you look at a rose, you'll see that the shadows are in the cave part of the flower, and as it comes out into the sunlight, it gets gets lighter. And here's some nice wet into wet. Here's another one. Now there might be a flower. Let me see if I have an example here. Yeah, something like this, where there's so many petals that you actually wouldn't want to do each petal separately, but you can get your crayon resist or masking fluid resist, or even Sharpie pen or a Pitt pen in there, and that's going to abstract it, because as soon as you emphasize an outline, you flattened it and made it more abstract. But that's what Georgia O'Keeffe did also. So on this case, the whole flower could have been done all at once, and the petals would be differentiated by the contour drawing. So here's a photograph where you can definitely see a value change, graded wash on the sunlight and shadow. And then on this one, not only do you see sunlight and shadow, but you see what would probably be a wet into wet, where the oranges kind of bleed into the yellows. Another technique I'm going to show you is using a stick or a credit card or a palette knife. So you can, if you scrape into the paper while it's wet, the paint will run into that little groove that you created, and you can get some dark linear qualities. And that could also be in leaf veins also, like we were talking about this past week. Here's another one where you can definitely see a graded wash. And this one also. don't shy away from a flower just because it doesn't have really bright colors. You can get some gorgeous results with a real pale colors and then go in with a strong, definite background that would go right up to the edge and really make it pop out. Doesn't this look like Wet into Wet right here? And then you can see some lines that would be created by a stick or scraping, but maybe when it's more the magic moment, when it's a little bit drier, and you could scrape into that. So this is an example of what I'd like you to try. Not only are you going to do your drawing and transfer it onto your paper, and you won't start painting the actual thing yet, but you can do a couple of these little practices. So you want to think about a secondary color, orange, purple, or green, and you're going to create those secondary colors by mixing the primaries, either a magenta or a permanent rose kind of red and a blue to create purple, or a turquoisey blue like manganese or cerulean, and yellow to create that. And you let it just kind of happen, and you get that unexpected explosive looking color. So I posted a photo of this. I don't know if you can see the whole thing on my camera right now, but I did post a photo of this chart. And a lot of these things are leftovers from when I was teaching high school and teaching the kids classes, so that they would see, you know, I'd go up to them and say, well, what step are you on? While they were sort of zoning out. So it was nice to know those steps. So anyway, I'd like you guys to try a crayon or a oil pastel if you have one. If you don't, just use a Sharpie or a waterproof pen. And you're going to draw 4 petals, 4 big petals on a piece of practice paper. And I'm using just a white drawing paper, but I've tested it out in the past and it works really good for Wet into Wet. So I'm not using my good Arches paper. And I've got my primary colors already on my palette, red, yellow, and blue, and in the different variations, the cool and warm variations of that. And we're going to try something where we kind of dab, dab, dab around the perimeter and see what happens. So here's a paper. And I'm going to do, let's start with some purple leaves. And I'm going to draw, so I'm thinking, what's the complementary color of purple? And it's yellow. So I've got either an oil pastel or a regular Crayola crayon, and they both will resist paint. So the oil in the oil pastel pushes away the watercolor, and the wax in the crayon pushes away the watercolor. So I'm going to do some nice big petals. I'll do a couple with crayon, and we'll see if there's a difference. Sometimes one works better than the other. And here's the oil pastel. So to make the secondary color of purple, I'm going to use red and blue. And my thinking is, if I use more of a permanent rose, sort of a magenta color, I'm going to get a better purple than if I use the orangey color. And the blue that might work the best is an ultramarine. And although I could use a turquoisey one also. So here's what I'm going to do. There's a couple ways to do this, but on this one, I'm going to wet the whole petal. And as any teacher hopes, we hope that the demo and the video will actually work. But what I'm going to do is start with one color, and this first time on this one I'll start with red and just see if there's any difference depending on which one I start with. So I'm using the permanent rose, and what I'm going to do is kind of dab around the perimeter. I'm not going to try and fill it all in. I'm going to leave some white, and you can see how I'm going to go right up to that yellow outline. And this, I think this was the crayon outline. And you can see the paper's buckling, so we're getting some interesting little... So I'm going to stay away from the center and let the paint just kind of run into the center, going all the way up to that, you know, maybe even beyond. And while it's still wet, I'll go in with the ultramarine blue or cobalt blue, either one, maybe a mixture. And I'm going to dab, dab, dab with that. Now what's going to happen is, my hope is that they will bleed together and become purple. But it won't be the same as mixing the purple on my palette and putting it on there. So I'm just going to let that keep painting itself. It got a little heavy on the blue, so maybe I'll go back in with a little more red. That the ultramarine's pretty strong. Now on this one, I'll do the oil pastel on this one. I'll wet it again, and the yellow crayon or oil pastel is sort of acting as a dam, so they won't run into each other. It's a barrier. And on this one, I'm going to start with the blue. Maybe I'll put a little bit of a turquoisey in there too, the peacock blue. And again, I'm going to, you can see that's turning a nice purple up there. So I'll start with blue, and then I'll add the red second. And this is kind of fun, you know, put on some soft music, and or if you are like some of my students, some wild rock and roll. And now I'll use the permanent rose second. And we'll just see if there's any difference in how these two react. So it's dab, dab, dab. It's not stroking, it's dab, 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 dab. And I can pick it up and sort of let it move around if I want, but I don't want to brush it in. I notice this is not moving as much into the center because there's a big bump in there. But it's kind of fun to see. Maybe I'll help it a little bit up that steep hill. We want to have a little white still showing. That gives it a nice glow. Okay, so let's just compare what this would look like if I mixed it on the palette first. It would have a little bit different look. So here's the permanent rose and the blue. So I've got the purple, and I'll use a bigger brush. So it's more homogeneous. And I could change the proportion. I'll go in with a little permanent rose. I hope I'm using the permanent rose. Yeah. I'll go in and add a little extra permanent rose. And a little extra blue. And just kind of see what happens. So I sort of put a base coat of a mixture already there. So you can see. Now let's try a graded wash. So we're thinking in terms of the maybe the darkest part of the petal being more toward the center. And so I'm going to use this mixture I have already, and we'll see if we can make this work right. So I've got the purple, and I'm going to go in, I think this will work. I might want to use a bigger brush. So I'm going to go in on dry paper this time, and I'm going to put a little bit of purple. Actually, I am going to use the smaller brush. Then I'm going to dip in a little water and dab it on the sponge, and I'm going to overlap it. I think we did this with the mountains on the graded wash distant mountains on the sunset silhouette. Then I'm going to start to, each time I'm overlapping a little bit, I'm taking a little paint out, putting a little water in, and I'm bringing it farther out by overlapping it. So this paint is mixing with that until I'm almost just working with dirty water as I get toward the edge. And it doesn't necessarily have to be from here to here. It could be from there to there, or left to right if there's a sunlight source. And then maybe I'll use a clean brush and go back and smooth it out a little bit and go back again. So I'm getting a gradation of, maybe I could put a little bit more around the edges. So you can see it's not all one value. And I used a pre-mixed color on dry paper. So these are just some different ways to handle the paint. I'm going to do one more with a different color. Because we have also orange and green as our secondary colors. So I'll let that sit there. And so if I'm going to try a green petal, or it can be a leaf. So I'll use a red outline, and I'll make it sort of a leafy shape. And then I'll try some orange petals. Let's do a couple of green ones, and then the complementary color of orange is blue. So I'll use blue for this and this. So I'm going to get some fresh water. And clean my palette a little bit there. Dip my sponge in the water, squeeze it out. Just because I'm trying to get some pure color here. Okay. So let's try the green. So what we're thinking is like a turquoisey blue. Like here's manganese, oh, here's cerulean. No, this is cerulean, excuse me. And this is manganese. So you can see it's very turquoisey. And then we have like a lemon yellow there. So we're gonna wet it, just like we did on the other one. We're gonna dab, 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 dab with the yellow first. And we never really went back and looked to see, I don't know if you can see this, to see if there was much of a difference depending on which primary color we put first, and I don't see a whole lot of difference. So I'm going to start with the yellow, and then on this one I'll start with the blue. So I'll change to a different brush. And now I'll go in with the blue and dab, 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 dab. around the perimeter. Going right up to the edge. I'll go right up to that red. More yellow. Okay, we'll let that keep moving. And this, on this one, we'll wet it first again. Oops, we got a dirty brush here. And we'll go in this time with the blue first. Dab, dab, dab. And I want you to save these for next week because we can practice the backgrounds then on these little exercises. I'm going to go right up to the edge. Let's try a little peacock blue. We like that. That's a Holbein color. You can see we're getting the green this way. Now on this one, I'm going to go a little bit more in the inside because I want to try using the texture of the stick or the palette knife. So on this, yeah, I'll do it on this one. It's still pretty wet, so I'm going to go in and scrape. And I could have used a credit card or just like a stir stick or a skewer. And it'll show better where there's more paint, where it's darker. So you can see we're getting some nice veins or some indications. So here would be an example where you'd want to use the stick on those maybe. Okay, we'll try it on this too. If I waited longer for it to be half dry and the shine gone, then I would get a light line. Okay, so that's another little technique. So the last color, or secondary color we haven't done is orange. So I'll just do one right here. I'm going to wet it. I'm going to use, this time instead of lemon yellow, I'll use New Gamboge. And then I'll use the, well, I could use either Permanent Rose or Scarlet Lake. Scarlet Lake's very orangey already. So I'm going to dab, dab, dab with this more of a school bus yellow that's heading toward orange anyway. And then I'll use some Scarlet Lake, or sort of a middle red. It's kind of a middle red. And I'm going to dab, dab, dab. You want to have enough water on there, nice and wet. If you're spending a lot of time mixing, and then you go back and realize your area has gotten dry, you want to go back in and wet it again. It's fiery. And that complementary blue really sets it off. I'm going to add a little bit more water right in the middle. Okay. Now on this last one, I'm going to do the graded wash one more time. And this time I'll mix some orange. I want to mix a nice big batch of orange. Let's just use the big brush to apply it. I'm going to have a loaded brush. So I'm going to put the, a little bit too much water. On dry paper, I'm going to put the darkest area right here. And then I will go in with a, put a little bit more here. Then I'm going to go in with, and dab a little water onto here and overlap. So that will be introducing a little water, add a little bit more water and overlap. So I'm wetting the leading edge of it a little bit more until I almost have no paint left in the brush. It's just dirty water. So I'm going to go back again and redistribute it. And this paper is pretty, not as nice as your arches, so it's buckling a lot more. I'm gonna emphasize with a little permanent rose, I'm gonna emphasize that dark inner edge there. So you just want to be able to show that some areas are darker and some are lighter on dry paper this time. So if you make a mistake at some point ever, which we all do, I would take a damp brush and just run it over that, and then take a tissue and hit it. You could also wait for it to be dry to do that, but sometimes you can get it right away. Okay, so there's what I want you to try and practice. Mixing secondary colors on wet into wet on these little practices, and then doing a graded wash in at least one of the petals, and then maybe trying the stick thing. And then save these and we'll practice some different techniques for backgrounds next week. I think that's all. Okay. Have fun.